Hello and welcome once again to The Blueprint. This is Canada's Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, with new content for you every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We have lots to talk about, so please, if you like the show, please comment, subscribe, share it. Allow us to push back against the ever-moving Liberal agenda, because I guarantee you what you're hearing now today will not be something you're obviously hearing in the mainstream media, so we need your help to do that. And of course, if you can't watch or listen to the entire program right this second, you can download it, listen to it on platforms like CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, you name it, it is out there. And of course, we're back in Parliament. Parliament is back in session after a 2-week constituency work week, and we are back in studio. As you can see, we have two guests. Two familiar people to the show. We have Richard Bragdon, the Member of Parliament for Tobique, Mactaquac, in the beautiful province of Manitoba. Not Manitoba, that's our next guest. Beautiful province of New Brunswick. He's also the Deputy Critic for Ethics and Accountable Government, which keeps him quite busy nowadays. And of course, Larry Maguire, Member of Parliament for Brandon Souris, Manitoba, the beautiful province of Manitoba, and the Deputy Critic for Natural Resources. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming.
Good to be with you.
Pleasure to be here.
We have a lot to talk about. I wore my orange tie special for today because today we hear that there is a new alliance in Parliament. Richard, it is the Liberal-NDP Alliance, or is it the NDP-Liberal Alliance? Who holds the balance?
That's a great question. And I think, obviously, you can't really distinguish those two parties at this point. I think to say that they're far left would be an understatement. And I think Canadians are going to be rightly concerned about the direction of the country, where already the cost of living is quickly getting out of sight. Inflation is continuing to get out of control. Cost of housing is getting out of reach for people. And then they think of more government spending, could be a lot of reckless new programs and spending put in place. Could cause a lot of problems for Canadians. And it's going to hit them once again in the pocketbooks, where we least need it right now.
Absolutely. So for those just tuning in, the NDP and Liberals have announced a deal that will take them right through 2025 with no chance of election, because the NDP will then support the Liberals on matters of confidence, matters that could bring down the House of Commons. So for those of you watching or listening that may have questions about when the Conservatives can table a matter of non-confidence, when will the budget be where there could be a vote of non-confidence, we can go into an election. This will ensure that that does not happen until 2025. So, Larry, today we're talking about a bunch of things in Parliament today. It's the Conservative Opposition Day. We're talking about the cost of living. We're talking about ways to help Canadians in the pocketbook, because they're getting hammered every way you look. Gasoline, groceries, anything and everything is on the way up.
Transportation for sure. And I was 14 years in a Manitoba NDP government as an opposition, as a Conservative MLA there. And we've got a Prime Minister that outspends that NDP government, which was very spend happy at that time. They weren't spend thrift, believe me. And this Prime Minister has outspent them, makes them look like child's play in regards to spending. And part of that, we were supportive as far as helping people get through COVID. But there's a lot of this is untracked spending, and it has nothing to do with COVID. So this government is outspent. I think we've already elected the first NDP Prime Minister in Canadian history, and his name's Trudeau. And, but we need to be cautious, because the motion that we put forward today is an Opposition Day motion from the Conservative Party, is one to just alleviate a small fraction of that by getting rid of the GST on fuels. And everybody in Canada has to travel someplace to get to work, take the children to hockey practice or music lessons, just wherever they're going. And it's really hard on families right now. When MNP did the study that shows 50% of Canadians are within $200 of insolvency at the end of every paycheck. This is really harsh on families.
Absolutely, and especially the parliamentary budget officer said 1/3 of all spending that was done during the pandemic had nothing to do with COVID, but was couched in the language of COVID. And I think that's the issue we had, and especially when all this printed money into the atmosphere is causing massive problems for people, especially those in the housing market.
Well, when you look at the housing market, Jamie, it's severe. I believe it's 6 years ago when Mr. Trudeau became Prime Minister. The median price, or the average home price in Canada, was like $429,000, in that ballpark. And that has over doubled in 6 years, to where the median price for a home, or average price, is over $870,000. That is totally unattainable for so many Canadians across the country. And for people starting out wanting to purchase their first home, that just seems like a faraway, distant dream. now. And so what can we do to somehow hold this government in check, especially now that they're moving further to the left, let alone on the whole issue of making sure that we're much more energy secure, much more have a much more stable and secure food supply chain, and increasing our manufacturing capacity, because there doesn't seem to be any interest in any of that from either the NDP or the Liberals. Already they've had a boot on the energy sector of this country, and it's having devastating consequences, not just for us here at home, but also internationally. We've got to start replacing dictator oil and energy with democratic oil and energy, and I think that certainly would be things that we'll be advocating as Conservatives to make sure we got to look at this whole thing and get Canada back on the right track, because we have unbelievable potential.
Absolutely, we do.
But we're suffering under a lack of vision, and whatever vision they do have, it's more government spending.
Yes.
And less private sector growth. We need the opposite.
Well, we've doubled federal spending, and we know what happened. And that seems to be a badge of success for this Liberal government. How much can we spend? It doesn't matter if you actually get results. It's what we spend. We just talked about housing. We talked about gasoline. What about food, Larry? You're a farmer. Fertilizer prices, farmers are really worried about this.
Well, they are, and thinking the CP has gone back to work at noon today here, just an hour or so ago. But it is costly on food. We've got a war going on in Ukraine, a Putin war, not a Russian war. It's driven by Putin, and Ukraine provides 30% of Western Europe's and food supply, and it's a big problem there. And Russia also supplies food. Neither one of them are going to be able to do the proper job of putting a crop on the ground this year, and this has just exacerbated the costs of things like fertilizer and transportation of crop inputs here in North America as well and around the world. And so we could end up with a food shortage in some areas of the world, and we're already seeing people, going hungry in Ukraine just trying to get out of the country. We need to make sure that our supply chains are intact to be able to provide not only the finished products that help as farm inputs, but the manufacturing of those products through natural gas and other means while we transition. But we know, I always say you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We've really got to make sure that while we are transitioning, that we continue to use the full potential of what's in front of us right now.
Well, as an Ontarian, I sat through 15 years of Liberal rule, and we saw what used to be the manufacturing hub of Canada slowly get decimated over those 15 years because of failed Liberal policies. And those same brain people are here in Ottawa now, and it seems to be we're going down the exact same track. And we here in Ontario have some of the highest electricity rates anywhere in North America. Let's talk about, so if we want to talk about manufacturing and bringing back those jobs and building things, we have to address the key issues that are deterring investment in those kind of things. Quickly, let's talk about oil and gas. We talked about it a few times, especially because Larry just mentioned the conflict in Ukraine. Even if we wanted to, as a nation, as Canadians, wanted to supply the European market and others with oil and natural gas to displace some of the Russian oil and gas that is it is supplying a vast majority of Europe, especially Germany, with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline upon completion. Even if we wanted to, we can't, because we can't build anything in this country. The Liberals have made it almost impossible.
The bills that they put in place, the regulatory regime that they have in place, has disproportionately and unfairly stifled and strangled our energy sector. And our Canadian energy sector has a great story to tell. We have some of the best environmental regulation in the world. We pay our workers good wages in the energy field and sector. It's a great news story. Would it not be far better for Canada to be the provider of the world's energy in comparison to unsavory, authoritarian, and dictatorial regimes? And when you put it to Canadians like that, it makes sense to Canadians. And I've heard more and more in my riding back home and across New Brunswick, and I think this is happening across the country. It's time we are getting our energy resources to the world that need it. It can prosper our country while at the same time make us less reliant on foreign sources of oil from unsavory places. And I'll just say this, and I know Larry will have much more to add to this, being on the committee as well, but the Keystone XL pipeline, for example. The United States, up until just a couple of weeks ago, were importing to the tune of 680,000 barrels a day of oil and crude from Russia. You know how much the Keystone pipeline could have been providing the United States at the same time with good, democratic Canadian oil? 800,000 barrels a day. Amazing.
Yeah, the Americans will say, well, they would take 2 years to complete, but they canceled it 13 months ago. We would have been upon completion.
Exactly.
This would have been already ready to go. So that argument, I don't deal with at all. But what really frustrates me, Larry get into this too, is that the first thing Joe Biden did, was to cancel Keystone. One of the next things he did was lift the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which allowed Russia to provide energy to Germany, put them dependent on Russia.
Literally over a barrel.
Yeah, fund this war and neuter the position of Germany and other European countries, because that was allowed to happen. And then when the United States became dependent, Joe Biden begged OPEC to up their production. When they wouldn't do that, he went to Venezuela. Like, where was this prime minister to say, Mr. President, we're right here?
Exactly.
We've got the lowest carbon fossil fuels in the world here, under the best regimes of extraction that my colleague on the Natural Resources Committee, Richard, just pointed out here. And yet, here we are. We're in a position to be able to supply. We had a group in from Finland the other day. We could supply them. 20% of their energy is coming from Russian oil right now. We could have supplied that. Qatar just signed an agreement with Germany over the weekend to supply some of the fuel that they were getting from Russia. There's alternatives to that energy, and we are in a great position to have been able to supply that if we'd have had the initiative and direction and vision over the last 5 or 6 years to be able to move those products. We also have to be very cognizant of the other elements as we move to the other sectors of society, or the new types of energy that the Liberals and the NDP want to talk about, and we are as well. The critical elements are the things that we also talk about here. China controls 80% of those in the world, Jamie. And, we have our own sources here, and very good sources, but if the critical elements were cut off to Canada, how then can we supply our own needs with the batteries that we need in the future, electric vehicles and everything else that may be coming down the road? But right now, that's why I say about the future, but right now we've got these fossil fuels in front of us that our neighbors and allies really need in the world, and we should be able to supply them, and we can't.
Yeah, you're right. The Liberals, and we do too. I think all parties are talking about moving away from fossil fuels, and what does that look like? But I think the difference here, when we talk about adding in terms of adding more options that are cost effective and widely available. I think the Liberals and NDP, that coalition, just wants to subtract, right? There's a period of time where we are now A to when we get to point B, when we're off fossil fuels. What happens in the middle? I think that's the important question. The Liberals and NDP want to just shut down oil and natural gas. But what happens to the cost of available energy sources to keep people warm, to fuel their vehicles, to get them where they need to go, like to run their everyday? That the middle is what the left is missing.
Totally agree, Jamie. And this is the difference between fanciful ideologues and idealism, where, oh yes, it would be in an ideal world, we would be beyond carbon fuels. But then there's the reality of where people are living right now. And what they know, the reality is, every time they're filling up their car, it is costing more and more from their back pockets and taking out of their family's budget every month. What we do know is that we now have cross-jurisdictional comparisons that we can look at. We know other jurisdictions became, not too long ago, the world's #1 energy exporter and developer and producer of energy, while at the same time reducing their carbon footprint more than what we were doing here in Canada under this current administration. While we virtue signaled and we talked about becoming green, our carbon emissions kept going up, while others were developing their natural gas sector and transitioning and using those fuels to replace coal and to supply the world with democratic energy sources. I think it's worthy of a reevaluation. When we are blessed with the kind of resources we have in this country, we need to be the champions of all types of energy. I'm for all the above, whether it's nuclear, whether it's solar, wind, all of that's great.
But that's adding. That's the adding part, right?
We are still, for the foreseeable future, we're all still running largely on petroleum products.
Yes.
And a lot of the people who virtue signal the most on this stuff are some of the worst abusers of it themselves. And so, anyways, I think it's a little bit rich for me, but I get a little frustrated, and I think average Canadians do, because these types of measures that are being brought in disproportionately affect those who live in small towns or rural communities, who grow our food, who produce our goods, and they are being punished disproportionately, including our seniors who are on fixed incomes, because of carbon tax legislation and these schemes of wealth redistribution. We need to bring some common sense and reality back to the situation.
Well, Larry, what happens in a few more days, April 1st? The carbon tax goes up.
Carbon tax goes up.
We're spending almost $2 a liter or more in certain parts of this country for a liter of gasoline.
Yep.
This drives everything up. On top of the already supply chain issues, the inflated currency problems we have. The dollar that you have now is not buying as much, and this is the worst time for this to happen.
It's hard on every Canadian. Rich and I come from rural areas, and it's disproportionately hard on those because, as I said in my speech this morning in the House, all of my constituents in Brandon Souris have to basically travel to the neighboring town to work, go to get supplies, to between communities, drive their kids to school, music lessons, as I said earlier, and there's a huge cost involved. Now, all of the things that we consume in those rural areas have to be delivered to us, and so it affects the trucking industry across Canada. Another thing that I think we haven't taken into consideration is the efficiencies in the engines of North America already that's taken place over the last 10, 20 years, and the efficiencies, the amount of less fuel that we're using, and of course the efficiencies in agriculture, the industry that I come from and spent my life in. Yeah. When I look at the types of diesel tractors that I was using when I sold my farming operation to my neighbors, they were much more efficient for the amount of work they were getting done every day than the tractors my father's generation drove. So, and the types of fuel we're using were much cleaner. So
yes.
It's there's been major offsets done already in the industries that we have, and in transportation and production mechanisms, not just in those two industries, but in all of our industries.
And it really comes down to technology and innovation. And how do you achieve
Absolutely.
that? You have low taxes, less regulation, and allow the private sector to do what they do best. And we create these technologies.
We ran on a platform of using technology
Absolutely.
to be able to deliver to the rest of the world,
That's
to not
right.
just get our greenhouse gas. Sure, we'll get ours down, to do everything we can, but help the allies in the world and
Absolutely.
even some of the countries who aren't such major trading people.
But you can do that through
Let's put it that way.
competition.
Through competition and getting those
Yes.
technologies out into the world market.
Absolutely. We are running out of time. Quick.
Okay.
I do get, you both know the guests always have the last word. So I will turn it over to you, Mr. Bragdon.
Well, you're very kind, Jamie, but I think Canadians are increasingly wanting Canada to become much more self-reliant, to utilize the resources responsibly that we've been blessed with, but also to help the world out in a time of tremendous need while prospering our country in doing so. This makes sense. It's good policy. It's responsible both locally here at home, but also abroad. It's a story that makes sense. We just need to tell it, and more Canadians, I think, are going to embrace this. It's time to get good Canadian products to market.
I couldn't agree with you more. You are a great orator. It's an honor to be in your presence today. Mr. Maguire, take it away.
Yeah, well, I'll just finish by saying that we've got a situation where these natural resources help pay for our social programs in Canada
Totally.
too, and that's something that I think the Liberals and the NDP, while they talk a good talk, have forgotten a lot of the time. This is why Canada is the number one place in the world to live.
Yes.
Sorry, Jamie.
No,
I know
for
I'm
you, the
over
world.
time, but I want to just compliment what he's saying. And in regards to national unity, this is a national unity story. I come from Atlantic Canada. Mm-hmm. We are able to have hospitals and schools and have the government that we have and the services we have because of transfer payments that came from the West, from our oil and gas and energy sectors in large part. I, for one, am very thankful for that. And the last thing we need to be doing is continue to pit region against region. Let's build a great Canadian story and do it together.
Can't get any more east and west than this.
Absolutely.
You got it.
Well, think about what Energy East would have done for your province
Totally
of New
agree.
Brunswick.
I'm all for
taking
it.
Alberta Energy all the way to New Brunswick. That would have been a major job creation.
Big believer in that. We need those pipelines resurrected. We got a refinery right in New Brunswick that could sell refined petroleum products to the rest of the world at premium price.
And displace the bad actors. Richard Bragdon, Member of Parliament for Tobique, Mactaquac, the Deputy Critic for Ethics and Accountable Government, busy person today. Also, Larry Maguire, who spoke earlier in the House of Commons. I encourage you to check out his social media page and hear his speech. It's very encouraging. Member of Parliament for Brandon, Souris, and the Deputy Critic for Natural Resources. We appreciate you joining us here today. It was a great show. I think we covered a lot of ground. Lots more we could talk about, but please join us next week, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We will have new content for you. Please like, comment, subscribe, share this program. Together we can push back against the ever-moving Liberal agenda. If you can't watch or listen to the entire program, all our episodes are available. You can download it, listen to it on CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, you name it. It is out there. We'll see you next week. Low taxes, less government, more freedom. That is the blueprint.
Yeah.